All right, well, the last video I want to create for you today, you can probably tell I've made all these three in one day, um, is about Koch's postulates. And so Koch's postulates are still used today to kind of link what organism is causing what illness, right? And so if you go back in the previous slide, you'll see. So the criteria known as Koch's postulates are still used to try to establish a link between a particular microorganism and a particular disease, right? So it wasn't known until Koch's postulates, which really are a series of tests, honestly, or hypotheses. So you wouldn't know that maybe E. coli causes this particular illness, or tuberculosis, the bacteria, causes tuberculosis, right? So M. tuberculosis. And so what Koch did is derived these four postulates, and so what you would do is use these four postulates to see if in fact a particular microorganism is causing a disease, right? So the first postulate is the microorganism must be present in every case of the disease and absent in healthy organisms, right? So um, again, I'll point out some issues here. This is a pretty good way to test. The problem with some of this though is an example of like strep, right? So the bacteria that causes strep is can oftentimes be found in people that aren't exhibiting symptoms of strep throat, for instance. But in a good number of cases, if someone is sick, then you would expect to find evidence of microorganisms if it's a something that's caused by a microorganism. Then you would expect to find that in them and maybe not in healthy people, right? So number two, the suspected microorganism must be isolated and grown in pure culture. Again, for the most part, well, we can do that. So for instance, strep throat, you can swab the back of the throat and then grow up the strep bacteria in culture. The problem with number two, though, is we can't grow most bacteria. So when you see bacteria maybe growing in a petri dish or growing in a broth, um, we can't do that with most bacteria, and so that presents another little problem here um, with his postulates. But again, given the time he came up with these ideas, it's a pretty good way to test things. Number three, so the same disease must result when the isolated microorganism is inoculated into a healthy host, right? So if you have strep throat and you were to take some of that strep throat, obviously we couldn't do this, but you infect some other human with it, they get strep throat. That's another good indicator that that particular bacterium is what's causing the strep itself, and it's not something else. Um, some issues there might be just the maybe just the immunological differences between individuals or individual organisms, right? So maybe someone else gets the strep bacteria, and for whatever reason, their immune system fights it off, and so that could present you some issues there. And then the last of Koch's postulates is the same microorganism must be isolated again from the diseased host, right? So you take the strep from you because you had strep throat, and you give it to someone else. They must then be able to take that organism from that individual, right? Because maybe when you sampled the back of your throat and put it in someone else's, maybe you didn't get the actual strep, maybe you got something else, and so you can't be sure, right? And so here they're using the tuberculosis as an example, right? So a TB patient, you isolate tuberculosis from it, you grow it in culture, you give it to the guinea pig then gets tuberculosis and dies, and then you isolate tuberculosis from the guinea pig, right? And so there are a number of places you can use Koch's postulates. For instance, right now, a big problem in the world's oceans and the with the coral reef is coral bleaching and some diseases that are caused in coral reef. And so there's you can use Koch's postulates to test that, right? So you see if you can take bacteria from coral, give it to other coral that are probably in the lab, see if they develop the same symptoms, and if they do, you can take that isolate it again and see if it's the same bacteria, right? So that's one way that we can still use Koch's postulates. Um, what it does is it just establishes a way to kind of test things in a standardized manner so that we can see whether or not it is that thing that causes this thing. Um, and again, thinking about the time when this was developed, right? So 1843 to 1910, pretty groundbreaking stuff to be thinking along these terms. When it wasn't long before this, we were just figuring out what cells were or what that spontaneous generation didn't occur. Right, so that's Koch's postulates. Must find the organism in all ones that present with the disease. You must be able to grow it in pure culture. Um, the same disease must result when you give it, and then you must be able to re-isolate. Right, and so those are Koch's postulates. Study those. Probably something that I would ask you later.